I first saw Sarah at the Blue Room, UCLA's most popular student bar. She stood out immediately, not just because of her beauty, but because of her infectious laugh that carried across the crowded room. I was in my usual spot, nursing a beer at the corner of the bar, watching the scene unfold around me. That's what I did back then, observe from the edges, taking everything in. I wasn't antisocial, just careful. Life had taught me early on that getting too close to people could lead to pain, but Sarah's presence was magnetic. Every time she threw her head back in laughter, I found myself smiling involuntarily. Her friend group was always the liveliest in the bar, and she was clearly their center of gravity. I noticed how she listened intently when others spoke, how her eyes lit up with genuine interest. It was different from the superficial conversations that usually filled college bars. For weeks, I watched her from afar, memorizing her routine. She usually came in on Thursdays and Saturdays, always surrounded by friends. Sometimes she'd glance my way, and I'd quickly look down at my drink. I wasn't ready for those eyes to really see me yet. Then came that crowded Thursday night when fate decided to intervene. The bar was packed wall to wall, every table taken. I was in my usual spot when I heard that laugh again, closer this time. "Excuse me," she said, suddenly appearing beside me. "Would you mind if I shared this corner of the bar? Everywhere else is taken." My heart nearly stopped. Up close, she was even more beautiful. Warm brown eyes, a slight dimple in her left cheek when she smiled. "Please," I managed to say, gesturing to the empty space beside me. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "Nathan," I replied, hoping my palm wasn't too sweaty as I shook her hand. "I've seen you here before," she said, settling onto the bar stool. "You're always watching everyone." I felt my cheeks flush. "That obvious, huh?" She laughed. That wonderful laugh. "Well, you're not exactly subtle about it. But don't worry, I find it intriguing." Something about her directness put me at ease. We talked for hours that night. She was a psychology major, fascinated by human behavior. I told her about my business studies, my plans for the future, but I carefully avoided any mention of my past. The bar was closing when we finally looked at the time. "I have an early class," she said, gathering her things. "This was nice," I said, immediately cringing at how inadequate the words seemed. She smiled. "It was. Maybe we'll run into each other again." I watched her leave, knowing I was already in too deep. Over the next few weeks, our chance encounters became more frequent. We'd find each other at the Blue Room, picking up conversations like old friends. She made me laugh more than I had in years. But I kept my distance, emotionally at least, until one night when she finally called me out on it. "Why won't you?" "You asked me out, Nathan," she said bluntly. I nearly choked on my drink. "What?" "Don't play dumb. We both know there's something here. So what's holding you back?" I looked into those honest eyes and felt my carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "It's complicated," I said. "Try me." I took a deep breath. "I have requirements. Before I date someone." She raised an eyebrow. "Requirements? Like what?" "First, I need to meet their parents. Get their approval." She laughed, then realized I was serious. "Oh, interesting. What else?" "I don't want children. Ever. And that needs to be clear up front." I waited for her to get up and leave. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "That's different. But I appreciate your honesty. Most people find it weird." "Oh, it's definitely weird," she grinned. "But I like weird. And for what it's worth, I'm not sure I want kids either." Something shifted between us that night. We started spending more time together outside the bar. Study sessions in the library turned into coffee dates. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates. But I stuck to my principles. No official relationship until I met her parents. Sarah arranged it over spring break. Her parents lived in a modest suburban home in San Diego. Her father, Mike, was a high school teacher. Her mother, Linda, worked as a nurse. They were warm, welcoming people who clearly adored their daughter. Over dinner, I explained my intentions with Sarah. They seemed surprised by my formality, but appreciated it. "You're different from Sarah's previous boyfriends," Mike said. "Dad," Sarah protested. "In a good way," he added quickly. They gave their blessing, and something inside me relaxed slightly. That night, under the stars in Sarah's backyard, we shared our first kiss. It was perfect, sweet, tender, full of promise. But in the back of my mind, Rachel's face flickered like a ghost. I pushed the memory away, focusing on the present, on Sarah's smile, her warmth, her life. Our relationship blossomed over the next year. We graduated together in 2008, both landing jobs in Los Angeles. I proposed on a quiet evening at home, nothing fancy. Just us, some takeout Chinese food, and absolute certainty that this was right. The wedding was small, but beautiful. Sarah looked radiant in her simple white dress. Her father cried walking her down the aisle. I managed to keep my composure, barely. We bought a small house in the suburbs, started our careers. Life was good, better than I'd ever dared to hope for. Sarah brought out a playful side of me I thought had died long ago. We'd have elaborate prank wars that would last for weeks. She'd move all the furniture in my home office 2 inches to the left. I'd replace all her coffee with decaf. She convinced my coworkers to only speak to me in Pig Latin for a day. I'd hire a mariachi band to follow her around the grocery store. Our love life was passionate and tender. Every morning, I'd wake up amazed that this incredible woman was my wife. But sometimes, late at night, the old memories would surface. I'd find myself staring at Sarah's sleeping face, feeling guilty. Guilty because part of me still wondered about Rachel, about our child, about what might have been. I never told Sarah about them. How could I explain that my first love had supposedly died because of me? That somewhere out there, I might have a child? It was easier to keep that door firmly closed. Then came the morning that changed everything. Sarah was unusually quiet at breakfast. "I'm late," she said finally. "For work?" I asked, confused. She shook her head. "No, Nathan. I'm late." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "But we were careful," I stammered. "Birth control isn't 100% effective," she said quietly. I sat there, trying to process this information. A baby. The very thing I'd sworn I never wanted. Sarah watched me carefully. "I know what you're thinking. Do you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You don't want children. You've been clear about that from the start." I nodded, unable to speak. I'll make an appointment," she said, her voice breaking slightly. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The thought of Sarah going through that because of my fears. "No," I said firmly. She looked up surprised. "No," she repeated. "We're having this baby," I heard myself say. "But you don't want children." I reached across the table, taking her hand. I didn't want children because I was afraid. Afraid of history repeating itself. She squeezed my hand. "What do you mean?" But I couldn't tell her the whole truth. "Not yet. Just trust me. We're doing this. Together." 9 months later, Madison came into our world. The moment I held her, all my fears melted away. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes. A head full of dark hair like mine. Sarah's brown eyes. 2 years later, we welcomed Olivia. Our family was complete. I threw myself into fatherhood with unexpected enthusiasm. Friday movie nights became sacred family time. We'd pile onto the couch with popcorn and blankets. The girls would argue over which Disney movie to watch. I'd pretend to complain, but secretly loved every minute. Game nights were full of laughter and friendly competition. Sarah and I taught the girls the art of the practical joke. Perhaps we should have known that would come back to haunt us. But in those golden years, everything seemed perfect. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our traditions. The girls grew into beautiful, intelligent young women. Madison inherited Sarah's love of psychology. Olivia got my head for business. They both had their mother's laugh. But sometimes, in quiet moments, the old sadness would creep in. I'd find myself wondering about my first child. Would they have my dark hair too? Rachel's blue eyes? Would they be grown now, with children of their own? Sarah would catch me in these moments sometimes. "Where do you go?" she'd ask gently. "Nowhere," I'd reply, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about work." She never pushed, but I could tell she knew there was more. I should have told her then. Should have trusted her with my past. But I'd buried it so deep for so long. And our life was good. Why risk ruining it? Besides, Rachel was gone. Our child with her. Or so I thought. The years flew by like pages in a wind-blown book. Madison got married first, to a young doctor she met during her residency. Olivia followed 2 years later, choosing a successful tech entrepreneur. Suddenly, our house felt too big, too quiet. Sarah and I rattled around in it like loose change. I threw myself into work, staying later at the office. She did the same, taking on extra projects. We still loved each other, but something had changed. The spark that had always burned so bright seemed to flicker. Our famous prank wars became less frequent. Date nights turned into quiet dinners with more silence than conversation. I caught Sarah watching me sometimes, worry in her eyes. I knew she sensed my growing melancholy. How could I explain that empty nest syndrome wasn't my only demon? That spring brought back memories I couldn't share? Then Sarah started mentioning a new colleague at work, David, the charming new marketing director. She'd drop his name casually in a conversation. David had the most interesting presentation today. David suggested this great new restaurant. David's so funny. You should hear his stories. I felt a familiar fear stirring in my gut. Was history repeating itself in a different way? She started working later, attending more team meetings. Her phone would buzz with messages late at night. She'd smile at the screen in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. I wanted to confront her, but memories of my own secrets held me back. Why did I have to demand honesty? Then came that fateful morning in late March. A thick envelope arrived in the mail. Divorce papers. My hands shook as I read them. Irreconcilable differences. The legal language felt cold, clinical. Was this really how 35 years of marriage would end? I tucked the papers away in my desk drawer. Decided to wait until after work to talk to Sarah. But when I got home that evening, she seemed different, almost giddy with nervous energy. She kept giving me strange looks over dinner, like she was waiting for something. I didn't mention the papers. Days passed and still I said nothing. Sarah's behavior grew more peculiar. She'd take mysterious phone calls in whispered tones, stay out late without explanation. But instead of acting guilty, she seemed excited. March turned into April. The morning of April first dawned bright and clear. I sat at our kitchen table, divorce papers in front of me. Sarah had left early for work, another meeting. Why? David. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. I wasn't prepared for who stood on the other side. Rachel. She looked older, of course, we both did. But those blue eyes hadn't changed. They still held the power to stop my heart. "Hello, Nathan," she said softly. I gripped the door frame for support. You're dead," I stammered. A sad smile crossed her face. "That's what they wanted you to think." My legs felt weak. "Come in," I managed to say. She stepped into the house. Our house, Sarah's and mine. But looking at Rachel, it felt like no time had passed. Like we were 17 again, with our whole lives ahead of us. She perched on the edge of our couch, hands clasped in her lap. "I don't even know where to begin," she said. "Try the beginning," I replied, sitting across from her. She took a deep breath. "My parents, they found out I was pregnant." I nodded. This part one knew. They were furious. Said I had ruined everything. Her voice shook slightly. They gave me two choices: leave with them immediately, or they'd make sure I lost the baby. My fists clenched involuntarily. They took me to a private facility in Arizona. Told everyone I died of complications from an illegal abortion. Let you believe you were responsible. The room seemed to spin. But our baby? I whispered. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. We have a son, Nathan. The world stopped. A son? She nodded. His name is Nathan Jr. He's a cardiac surgeon now. Married, with two children of his own. I sat there, trying to process this information. A son, grandchildren, a whole life I knew nothing about. Why now? I managed to ask. My parents died 3 months ago. Car accident. With them gone, I finally felt free to look for you. She reached into her purse, pulled out a photo. A young man in surgical scrubs smiled at the camera. My eyes. Rachel's smile. Our son. He wants to meet you, she said quietly. He's known about you for years. I told him everything after my parents died. I stared at the photo, memorizing every detail. Does he hate me? Rachel shook her head quickly. No, he understands. He knows it wasn't your fault. He's eager to know his father. Just then, I heard a key in the front door. Sarah's key. My head snapped up, reality crashing back. Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at us. Her face went through a series of emotions. Confusion, recognition, horror. Nathan, she said, her voice strange. What's going on? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How do you explain something like this? Rachel stood up gracefully. You must be Sarah, she said. I'm Rachel Thompson, Nathan's first love. Sarah's face went pale. The one who died? Rachel shook her head. Not quite. I watched as understanding dawned on Sarah's face. The color drained from her cheeks. The divorce papers, she whispered. They weren't real. They were just part of an April Fool's joke. The irony hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at the papers on the table, picked up a pen. They're real now, I said quietly. And sign my name. Sarah staggered back as if I'd struck her. You can't be serious, she whispered. 35 years, Nathan. 35 years of marriage, and you're throwing it away for her? Rachel stood quietly, watching us both. I never stopped loving her, I said softly. And now we have a son. Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. A son? You have 2 daughters, Nathan. 2 daughters who adore you, who will never understand this. I felt torn in half. Part of me wanted to comfort Sarah, to take back my signature, pretend this was all a bad dream. But Rachel was here, alive, with a son I'd never known, a chance to reclaim what was stolen from us. I'm sorry, I said to Sarah. I never meant to hurt you, but I have to know my son, have to see what might have been. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. What about what was? She asked. What about everything we built together? I had no answer for that. Rachel touched my arm gently. Nathan, we should go. Our son is waiting. Sarah watched us walk to the door. This isn't over, she said, but we all knew it was. The drive to meet my son passed in a blur. Rachel filled me in on details of his life. Nathan Jr., successful surgeon, loving husband, devoted father. Everything I'd hoped my son would be. He was waiting at a private room in an upscale restaurant. When I saw him, my heart stopped. It was like looking in a mirror from 30 years ago. He stood up, extending his hand. Dad, he said simply. That one word shattered me completely. We talked for hours. About his life, his work, his family. About the stories Rachel had told him. About why he'd chosen to become Nathan Jr. I wanted to honor you, he said, even before I knew if I'd ever meet you. By the end of the meal, we were planning future meetings, family gatherings, making up for lost time. It felt surreal, yet perfectly right. When I finally returned home that night, the house was dark. Sarah had packed a bag, left a note, staying with Madison. Need time to think. I sat in our empty living room, surrounded by memories. Family photos on every wall. 35 years of life together. Had I just made the biggest mistake of my life? Or corrected one from 40 years ago? The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah moved out permanently. Lawyers got involved. Our daughters were shocked, confused, angry. But then they met Nathan Jr., met their older brother, saw the undeniable family resemblance. Surprisingly, they embraced him, embraced Rachel. "We always knew you carried some sadness, Dad," Madison said. "Now we understand why." The divorce proceeded quickly. Sarah didn't fight it. She seemed to understand something I couldn't explain, that some first love's never real. Et epsilon dit. They just wait, dormant, for the right moment to bloom again. Rachel and I married in a simple ceremony. Nathan Jr. was my best man. Our grandchildren were flower girls and ring bearers. Even Sarah came, bringing her new partner. Yes, David from work. Life has a way of working out strangely sometimes. Now, years later, our blended family gatherings are surprisingly peaceful. Sarah and Rachel actually became friends, united in their shared experience of loving a complicated man. Our children, all three of them, are close. Their kids call both women grandma. And me? I finally feel complete. The guilt I carried for 40 years has lifted. The sadness that shadowed my joy has faded. I have everything I never knew I wanted. A son I thought was lost forever. A love I thought was dead. And the family I built with Sarah, still intact, just different. Sometimes I catch myself staring at old photos. Wedding pictures from both marriages. Family portraits from different eras. The contrast doesn't pain me anymore. They're all part of my story. All pieces of who I am. Sarah still teases me about that last April Fool's prank. "You certainly showed me how it's done," she'll say. And she's right. Her prank backfired spectacularly. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe we all needed to be fooled a little, to find our way to where we were meant to be. Life rarely gives us second chances. When it does, they rarely come in the ways we expect. Sometimes they arrive disguised as endings, as pranks gone wrong, as ghosts from our past, standing on our doorstep. The trick is recognizing them when they come, having the courage to take them, even when it means hurting someone you love, even when it means turning your whole life upside down. Because sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen, for everyone to end up exactly where they belong. And